before the vessel was given a name, before soldiers whispered warnings about the red glass that twitched in the dark. There was only a famine-priest walking through the aftermath of war. He had served in temples once, though none of them would remember him kindly. In those days, he had knelt beside the dying and offered prayers meant to calm the body, soften the fear, and prepare the spirit for whatever silence waited beyond the final breath. But the priest heard something in that silence that others did not. He heard refusal. Not words, not thoughts, something older than language. The last animal command of flesh that we did not wish to end. He heard it in the clenched hands of soldiers, in the jaws of plague victims, in the shaking breath of children carried too late to sanctuary. Again and again, he watched bodies fail, while some blind hunger inside them clawed for one more heartbeat, one more breath, one more chance to remain. The priest came to believe that this final hunger was the purest force in the living world. Not love, not faith, not courage, hunger. The desperate need to continue, even when continuation had become impossible. And if such a force could be gathered, perhaps death itself could be delayed. He abandoned the temples and followed armies instead. He walked after carrion birds had already fed, and after gravediggers had grown too tired to finish their work. With needles carved from silver bone, he drew the last heat from fallen bodies before the cold could claim it. From open mouths, he collected the final convulsions of breath. From torn hands, he gathered the tension of fingers that had closed around nothing. It was not blood alone he harvested. It was unfinished appetite, the last violent wish to keep living. The priest forged this vessel far from any holy place. He chose sand, blackened in funeral fires, and melted it with resin, blood, and powdered iron taken from shattered weapons. The glass that emerged was thick, squat, and red as flesh seen through flame. Black sediment twisted through it in narrow veins, moving slowly even after the vessel cooled. Around its neck he bent an iron hook, curved like a claw, so it could be hung from a belt, a saddle, or the edge of an altar. But glass alone could only preserve, it could not hunger. So the priest descended beneath plague pits, where pale carrion worms nested in the dark. These were not ordinary things of rotten soil. They had been bred in crypts for generations, fed on sickness, fear, and abandoned remains until their bodies grew slick, translucent, and almost boneless. They were tiny, frantic creatures, all mouth and motion, starved beyond nature's design. They did not merely eat dead flesh. They fed on suffering. The priest placed them inside the red vessel while they were still blind and writhing. Then, over many years, he held the flask above the mouths of the dying and whispered prayers no temple would claim. Each final convulsion passed into the glass. Each refusal to die thickened the liquid. Each stolen breath made the worms swell. At first, the flask only warmed in his hands. Then it began to twitch. Even stoppered, something moved inside it. Not enough to shake the vessel. Not enough to spill its secret. But enough that anyone who touched it understood at once. This was not a remedy. It was a bargain. The priest called it mercy. The world would learn a harsher name. The first true test came on a battlefield where rain had turned ash into black mud. A young soldier was carried to the priest with his armor split and his breath breaking in wet fragments. No physician could save him. No prayer could smooth the terror from his face. The priest knelt beside him, uncorked the red glass, and poured a single measure between the soldier's lips. The effect was immediate. The soldier gasped as if dragged upward from deep water. Blood steadied beneath his skin. His vision sharpened. His shaking hands found strength enough to close. Wounds did not heal fully, but they tightened just enough. Pain did not vanish, but it retreated just enough. Life returned just enough for the soldier to sit upright and stare at the priest, as though he had seen the sun rise inside a grave. Then the flask paid its price. From the mouth of the vessel slipped two pale, frantic things, no larger than curled fingers. They struck the mud already writhing, slick with red sheen, twisting as if the open world burned them. They had no eyes, no bones worth naming, only mouths, hunger, and a desperate urge to become something more than they were. The soldier screamed when he saw them. The priest did not. He watched the little bodies convulse across the ground, seeking warmth, panic, movement, anything alive enough to answer their craving. One crawled toward the wounded soldier's boot. The other split open against a stone, shuddering as if death had found it before it had finished being born. When both were crushed beneath the boots of frightened men, the vessel grew still. The priest understood then. The flask did not restore life by mercy. It did not heal cleanly. It did not give the dying what they had lost. It substituted. Part of the stolen force had to become flesh. Part of the miracle had to be shaped into brief, crawling lives. They were the missing measure, the severed mercy, the unpaid debt made wet and visible. The soldier lived until dawn. The priest called that success. Word of the red vessel spread in whispers first. Mercenaries came to the priest after battles. Grave robbers brought him coin and stolen jewelry. Deserters came with infected wounds and trembling hands. All of them wanted the same thing, one more chance to survive what should have killed them. The priest gave them what they asked for. Each drink brought the same terrible renewal. Breath returned, strength answered, thought sharpened, blood warmed. But always the gift was lesser than it should have been, as though the draught had lost part of itself on the way to the body. Then the worms came. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Sometimes a wet handful of pale knots, twisting and dividing on the ground. They were not creatures in the natural sense. They were abandoned attempts at life, animated by leftover desperation. Half-born bodies with no purpose except to wriggle, feed, and die trying to become whole. The priest began keeping records. A shallow wound produced small things, quick to perish. Mortal terror produced stronger ones. Battlefield panic made them frantic. Betrayal made them bite. Those who drank while close to death received the greatest surge, but they also brought forth the hungriest shapes. He learned that the vessel required balance. Pain, vitality, and death had to return to one another. If the pale things were destroyed, the flask settled. If they escaped, the liquid inside darkened, and the next use became stronger, crueler, and less predictable. The priest no longer spoke of healing. In his private notes, he called the vessel a ledger. Every swallow was an entry. Every worm was a payment. Every survivor was a debt not yet fully collected. The priest's apprentices feared him before they hated him. They had once followed him because he promised to end needless death. They had watched him pull soldiers back from the edge of the grave and thought him a miracle worker. But over time, they saw what the vessel made of him. He stopped asking whether a patient should live. He asked whether the patient had enough hunger to be useful. He stopped mourning those who died. He harvested them. His camp became a place of red light and sealed jars, of twitching glass and shallow trenches filled with the things the vessel had birthed. Some died quickly. Others learned to crawl toward warmth. A few survived long enough to grow teeth. The apprentices planned to destroy the flask while the priest slept. They were too late. When they returned from gathering supplies, they found the camp in ruins. Remedies lay shattered. Tents had collapsed into the mud. Bones were scattered in circles around the central fire, stripped clean as though a swarm had passed through and vanished. The priest was gone. Only the red vessel remained. It stood upright in the ashes, stoppered once more, its iron hook bent outward like a waiting claw. Inside, the pale worms drifted slowly through the dark liquid, swollen and content. Black sediment curled around them like smoke. One apprentice reached for it. The vessel twitched toward his hand. By morning, the apprentices had fled in different directions. None carried the flask openly. None admitted who had taken it, but the vessel was gone. And wherever it traveled next, men learned its lesson too late. The vessel passed through many hands. A grave robber wore it beneath his coat until the scratching inside drove him mad. A desert raider used it after an arrow pierced his lung and survived long enough to kill the archer who had struck him. That starving queen hid it among holy relics and drank from it during an assassination attempt, only to watch pale things spill across her marble floor and crawl toward her wounded servants. In time, soldiers learned to use the curse deliberately. When cornered, a bearer would uncork the vessel and let the red contents slosh across stone, mud, or steel. The ground would writhe with shrieking tendon shapes and blind, grasping bodies. Enemies hesitated. Blades were misjudged, horses reared. Feet slipped on slick fragments of half-born flesh. In that confusion, the bearer survived. Not because the flask restored them cleanly, because it filled the world with enough frantic false life to distract death for a moment longer. The vessel became prized by those who had no patience for clean miracles. Duelists carried it into impossible fights. Raiders traded cities for it. Warlords chained it to their armor and called it blessed after surviving wounds that should have emptied them onto the ground. But dependence followed every use. Those who drank from the vessel too often began to change, not in body, but in judgment. They stopped seeing the pale creatures as lives, however brief and broken. They stopped hearing the wet impacts at their feet. They felt only relief first, cost second, conscience last. Soon they measured everything by the vessel's arithmetic. A promise could be spent, a stranger could be spent, a memory, a kindness, a name, a loyal hand reaching out in the dark. Of it could become fuel for one more step, one more strike, one more borrowed second. The vessel taught them that survival was not a virtue. It was an appetite. The longer one kept the vessel, the more personal its hunger became. At first, a bearer heard only faint movement inside the glass, a soft scratch, a slow wet turning, the sound of pale bodies pressing against the inner wall. It was easy to ignore in battle, harder in a quiet room. Then the liquid began to fold inward. Men swore they saw shapes beneath its surface, fingers, teeth, a mouth opening where no mouth should be. Some saw the faces of those who had died near them. Others saw the people they had abandoned to survive. The worst saw themselves. Her sellsword, named Kale, carried the vessel through 7 campaigns. He drank from it after a spear opened his side, after fever hollowed his bones, after a collapsing gate crushed his leg. Each time, the flask saved him just enough. Each time, pale things spilled out and died in his place. By the 8th campaign, the worms had begun to resemble him. Not fully, never fully, but enough. One had the crooked shape of his jaw. Another twitched with the same damaged hand he had carried since youth. A third, born during a siege, opened a tiny red mouth and formed the silent shape of his name before an enemy boot burst it against the stones. After that, Kale stopped sleeping. He watched the vessel at night and saw his own features pressing from beneath the surface, stretched and red, mouthing soundless pleas. He understood the truth too late. Every use taught the glass the pattern of its master's body. Every drop consumed brought the vessel closer to growing a replacement. Not a child, not a clone. A hunger wearing his outline. A life made from the pieces he had traded away. Kale tried to bury the vessel beneath a battlefield shrine. 3 nights later, he woke to find it hanging from his belt again. Warm against his hip, its iron hook threaded through leather he did not remember fastening. Inside the glass, something smiled with his mouth. No grave kept the vessel. No vault held it long. It was thrown into rivers and found in the nets of fishermen. It was sealed behind temple stone and discovered years later in the hands of a dying monk. It was buried with kings, stolen by thieves, lost in mud, carried by refugees, sold for bread, and traded for swords. Always it returned to places where blood had recently soaked the ground. Always it waited for desperation. Some called it a healing draught when they first survived because of it. Some called it a battlefield relic. Some called it a miracle too ugly for priests and too useful for soldiers to reject. But those who listened closely knew better. It was not made to preserve medicine, wine, or holy oil. It was made to preserve need, the infernal clutching instinct of flesh, the last panic before stillness, the hunger that refused to die cleanly. So the name changed as it passed from hand to hand. The old title, spoken by mercenaries and desperate survivors, was the Vessel of Borrowed Hunger. But those who had seen the faces forming beneath its red surface gave it another name. The Hunger Glass Reliquary, a vessel that remembers the shape of bodies, a relic that breeds the wish to live into writhing flesh, a ledger in glass, warm to the touch, heavy with the lives it has not yet broken into pieces, and somewhere in the dark it waits still, stoppered, patient, never empty.